No mai, haere mai, piki mai, kaki mai, kia ora e te whānau, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. 30 minutes, one guest, no cuts. What we record is what you get. Barbara Edmonds is the first woman to ever hold the finance portfolio for the Labour Party. Now, politicians love to boast about their business credentials, but Barbara Edmonds has genuine finance expertise as a specialist tax lawyer. And she's had something of a rags to riches road to Parliament. Her mum was buried on Barbara Edmonds' 5th birthday, and her father raised 4 children on the DPP in a house that doubled at times as a transit lounge for family members arriving from Samoa. At one point, there were 24 people living in that house. Barbara Edmonds says it was Labour Party policies and values that helped the whānau overcome those challenges. But what about the future? In an economy that has been in recession for 2 years while debates rage about tax and deficits and cuts to public services, what is it that Labour actually has to offer? Let's start the clock, 30 minutes with Barbara Edmonds. Barbara Edmonds, welcome to 30.
Thank you so much, and talofa lava to your viewers as well.
Thank you very much for coming into the studio. What comes to your mind when I say this word, capitalism?
Lots of things, if I'm really frank. For me, it's a growth in society in which wealth is accumulated, in particular at the top, and less so at the bottom. And it depends on a theory of that wealth being redistributed through a trickle-down type theory. It's also a way that our society probably quite recently has swung more towards. So, like I say, it means a lot of things to a lot of people, but for me, when you say capitalism, that's what I think of.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think our capitalist economy is working for most New Zealanders?
If you go and talk to the person in South Auckland, and if you go talk to, for example, Dave Leteli, who's just today had to announce that he's closing his food bank, they would say no, it hasn't worked. But then if you also read other newspaper articles and you see that there is a whole bunch of Kiwi billionaires who are in Barcelona celebrating the America's Cup, they would say possibly yes, that it has worked. So it depends on who you are, where you are, and again, how that wealth is accumulated or not for you.
We'll find out a little bit about who you are over the next half an hour. But what do you think? And are you talking about possibly taking Labour in quite a significantly different direction on the economy? I mean, that's a relatively dark view of capitalism that you've just given me.
Well, I think it's a view of capitalism, and for me, when a lot of people say to us that, or actually Treasury have said, there's some really big fiscal challenges coming down the road. In particular, they had a paper that said in 2060, 10% of our GDP is going to be on healthcare, 7 to 7.5% will be on the super. That's because it's good that we have older people growing older, but it's going to come at a cost. And so those challenges require some tough decisions by politicians of my generation. And I say my generation because in 2060 is when our kids are going to be retiring.
And are you tough enough to make those decisions?
Well, funnily enough, last week at the Mood of the Boardroom, one of the first questions that was said to me was, are you too nice for politics? And I said, well, I've got 8 children. What I should have added to that answer is, try me. So, you can be nice.
Is that a challenge to me?
No. I mean, I'm a nice person, but that doesn't mean I don't have the brains underpinning it to help steer what I believe will be tough decisions that our party will have to make and then offer to the electorate.
We'll talk about some of those tough decisions because they are undoubtedly tough, and they are ones that Labour has in the past not always risen to the challenge of, but we'll talk about some of them. But I want to get, and I want to allow our viewers and listeners to understand a little bit about where you come from. Your parents came from Samoa in the mid to 70s, 1976 I think it was. Mm-hmm. But tragically your mum died from cancer when you were just 4 and you I think you buried her on your 5th birthday. Mm. Huge pressure on your father, what he raised you and your siblings on the DPP.
Yeah, I mean, my mum died at the age of 35. Dad was 40, a widower, with 4 children with ages 11 and under. That's really young. I'm 43 now, and I remember when I turned 36, I didn't realise how much her early death had sat in my subconsciousness. So when I turned 36, it was kind of like, oh yay, I made it to 36. So it was tough for Dad, but he did the best that he could. And again, he was the eldest of Grandpa's 19 children, and he's the only one that got an education past year 10, past 4th form. So he knew the value of education, and that's why him and Mum came to New Zealand in the first place.
So you were born in the early 80s. I mean, a lot of immigration from Samoa. As we said in the intro, you had 24 people staying in the house at one point. Yeah. Incredible. The dawn raids of the Muldoon government in the 80s, did that affect your whānau at all?
Yeah, it did actually. And I didn't know that it affected our family because the shame sat there with my uncle and my father. So my uncle worked at the Morrow and Taylor shoe factory in Newmarket. They had a raid of their offices at 9:30 because the dawn raids didn't just happen in people's homes, they were also in their workplaces. He was arrested, put into Mount Eden prison, and then put on a plane and sent back to Samoa. He basically had my father, who was kind of the older brother, he is the oldest brother who was here, had to carry that sort of secrecy and that shame because my uncle didn't want my grandmother to know in the island. So he got shipped back to Samoa and he landed there and basically had to lie as to why he'd been taken back home. So yeah, it did affect us.
So you've come through the fire to end up in Parliament. You worked for a couple of National Party revenue ministers, didn't you, using your expertise as a tax lawyer for Judith Collins and I think Michael Woodhouse.
Yep.
Did you ever consider joining the blue team rather than the red team?
So I was asked, not necessarily by those 2 ministers, I was asked,
You were asked by National?
Yeah, I don't know whether it was nonchalantly or jokingly or more seriously, but for me it was definitely a no. And, I worked as a public servant in their offices, and so tax for a lot of it is a lot of remedial stuff and a lot of remedial work program tax policy stuff, except for the big ticket items. So it was easy for me to work for both Judith and for Michael, and they were really good people to work for.
You said in your maiden speech, and you've given us some of that glimpse now, that it was Labour Party policies and values that saved the whānau at those points, those critical points, right? Do you count Roger Douglas as part of that legacy that you are proud of?
Yeah, well, he is part of that legacy, right? So Roger Douglas obviously opened up New Zealand. People who would probably laud a capitalist type framework would say that, that was one of the biggest structural reforms that New Zealand undertook at the time, and that's true. We did. But we're also, I feel like we're at another crunch point where, given those huge fiscal challenges coming down the road, it may be time for another structural reform. And that's sort of coming out a bit through the discussion that we're having both as a party, but both also what the private sector are saying as well.
2 fascinating things that I think you've just said there. Firstly, I want to go back to Rogernomics just quickly, because most Labour people you talk to, possibly older than you, maybe of another generation, that is a third rail thing that they don't want to touch. You seem to acknowledge that he did good things for the New Zealand economy?
I think the main thing that I acknowledge with Roger Douglas is there's no point us sort of being shameful of our past. It happened. The major thing for us as a Labour Party is understanding that did happen and looking forward. But you can't dismiss that happened, and that there have been some good things that have happened as a result of that, with the result of our New Zealand dollar being floated to help our export markets, which then creates jobs. And that's fundamentally, that is a Labour value, is around work and jobs. So whether I am saying this and whether there'll be members of the party that will frown upon me, I'm not saying everything that he did was good, but I'm saying that is part of our Labour history and we need to look forward from there.
And are you saying also that we face a similar kind of rupture than we did in the mid-80s with these new challenges that are coming down the pipe?
I think because the fact is it's now evidence that those challenges are coming, it would be remiss of us as a Labour Party, a progressive party, to turn a blind eye to that. And so that's what the challenge is really for the Labour Party going forward, is how do we meet those challenges? And everybody asks me about tax because I am a tax lawyer, and sometimes I think I should have been a criminal lawyer, so they won't ask about that. But tax is an element of that picture. So is that productivity, growth and jobs story as well.
We will talk about tax, I promise you. Yeah. Are you a fiscal conservative?
I have been described as a fiscal conservative. I don't really know. I mean, I'm not too sure what the definition of a fiscal conservative is, right? If that's about staying in line with what Treasury suggests is what you should have debt to GDP, expenses to GDP, then maybe I am. But the problem is that I also had 8 children, and you learn ways to be able to look after your family. You take risks. I could be really rich if I didn't have 8 children, put it to you that way. But the thing is that I look at the whether I'm fiscally conservative or fiscally liberal. I don't label myself in that way, and it would depend on who you talk to as to whether I would be. Also, it'll be our challenge when I put together our fiscal plan for the next election. Then you'll see really whether I'm a fiscal conservative or liberalist.
You've said in speeches that I am a pragmatic rather than ideologically fixated in politics. So what would be an example then of an idea that may be perceived to be centre-right that you would be willing to entertain?
So, for example, the one policy actually that came through the last coalition government was the Regional Provincial Growth Fund. For some people, they'd say, well, especially now doing these big slush funds and available, and, obviously New Zealand First has renegotiated that as part of their new coalition agreement. Most people probably say you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't have these kind of pools of funds to be able to just spend on particular projects that have a criteria. And probably more when I was a policy person, I probably would say, yeah, I agree with that. However, when I've been to go see these projects, when I've been down to Opotiki and seen those mussel farms, when I've seen the technology that it's paid for, then I get a bit more understanding as to why sometimes you have to earmark types of funding pools for those particular types of projects.
Okay, let me give you another one. Kiwi Bank and selling down Kiwi Bank to give it enough capital to take on the big Aussie banks. I mean, partial asset sales is a sort of a centre-right idea largely. Is that something you would be willing to entertain in this spirit of pragmatism that you've talked about?
Kiwi Bank needs to stay in Kiwi hands. It was established by Sir Michael Cullen to be that disruptor, to be that additional bank that keeps Kiwi profits onshore.
So no to a sell down in any shares of that? 100% has to be 100% New Zealand owned?
So this is the bit where the pragmatism comes in, right? I need to see where the government's going to go with it because I don't have all the advice around what the different options are. And this is where the pragmatism and the evidence base for me comes.
But would you be willing to entertain the idea of a partial sell down of Kiwi Bank?
I think that's a call that I would have to go back to my party to ask them what is our policy on this. And as much as whether I personally agree with it or not, I am that really big team player. And for something that fundamental, I would need to go back to the party and say, what do you think? Do we need to own 100? Can we own 51%? Can we own 49%? What are the trade-offs as a result of this?
But you're not ideologically opposed to that by the sound of it.
It's not that I'm not ideologically opposed. You need to have it evidence-based. We wanted it to be a disruptor. Well, Sir Michael Cullen wanted it to be a disruptor. He wanted to keep the profits onshore. So is there a way instead that you can have somehow keeping the profits onshore, keeping the disruption, but raising the capital that it needs? And it may not necessarily be the government fully owning it, but if so, where are the boundaries which Labour are willing to go to? For example, it did used to be owned by the super fund in ACC. Is it time to relook at that? Could that work again? Keeps the profits onshore, keeps it as a disruptor, raises capital.
You've also lamented the fact that unemployment is predicted to rise to 5.2%, which would mean an extra 27,000 people on unemployment benefits. That's really a direct result of monetary policy, isn't it? We've had a Reserve Bank engineering a recession to tame inflation. Is Labour willing to explore alternatives to monetary policy?
Well, we did. We added the additional remit for employment, maximum sustainable employment.
You did. That was a tweak. But previously, you had the variable savings rate that you went to the election with in 2014. compulsory saving and you hike the compulsory savings rate up or down to heat or cool the economy. Is that an idea that merits another look?
Given the fiscal challenges we've got ahead, and I've said that we probably need structural reform, that would be something that we would look at. But again, we need to go through that policy process.
You would look
as a
at
party.
that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. On spending, we talked about whether or not you're a fiscal conservative, and you dodged that fairly adeptly, I thought. But did Labor spend too much money when it was in government last time?
It's so easy to govern in hindsight. Absolutely is. But if you go on the Treasury website and you have a look at the funding that was set aside for COVID, so they have to report, the Auditor General basically said that you need to basically report on these projects and where the money went for COVID. You know, $19 billion of it went on the wage subsidy. You go through line by line and you see where that money went. It went to people, to help people stay in jobs, and fundamentally helped save lives as a result of it. The government made a really big call to basically shut down the country. So we had a responsibility back then to ensure then that people kept their businesses alive and kept in touch with their workers.
But what, core Crown expenses went up 84% since 2017. I mean, did you bust the trust of the public by spending too much? Because that is the impression when you talk to a lot of Kiwis, that is what Labor did.
Yeah, and it's also the thing that you hear from the National Party about wasteful spending, but yet the $2.5 billion that was put aside for infrastructure, I mean, I went to fire stations across the country and opened them because we basically put in $52 million to upgrade 26 of them. You know, when I was going to cut those ribbons for these new or improved fire stations, the National Party was right there with me. So you can't say it's wasteful spending, and yet the money we spent on fire stations, on surf lifesaving clubs, on libraries, on school pools, the whole point of that $2.5 billion infrastructure fund was to ensure that the economy kept moving post-COVID, and that's what we believe helped to keep people in the infrastructure sector going.
Would surpluses be a priority for you as Finance Minister?
There's no point basically paying off your mortgage if your kids are hungry and sick. So yes, we need to move to surplus, but not at a point where you cut back public services so bad that it's difficult for people to, one, get the care that they need in our health system. We're seeing that with hospital bills. We're seeing that with workforce shortages. Yes, workforce shortages take time, but what we've seen is, for example, the nurses, we're seeing with Te Whatu Orders books that have been open in the last few days, it is showing that it's because there's been too many nurses. But if you ask the frontline workers, they'll say, what's too many nurses? We need nurses. You know?
So would Labor borrow more?
Borrow more for the right asset if we needed to. We still need to work through that process of our fiscal plan, but both Chris Hipkins and I have said if we're going to borrow, it needs to be for capital infrastructure projects, given our infrastructure deficit.
But you would be willing to borrow more than the current government?
If we had to.
They are talking about peaking at about, 43.5% of GDP, I think the number is. What are your ceilings?
So we're still working through that as a party.
But it'd obviously be higher than that.
Well, the thing is, with their borrowing, the $12 billion that they borrowed, it was for tax cuts. So potentially that 43.5% of GDP could have been lower.
Well, would you reverse the tax cuts?
Well, again, it'd be really difficult politically to do that. And to be fair, that's not a conversation I've had with Chippy, but I don't think we could go backwards from those tax cuts. They're basically glued in, you know, and so we need to deal with that as we look forward.
Let's talk a bit more about tax. And, you know, you are a specialist tax lawyer. Is New Zealand's tax system fair?
Again, depends on who you talk to. And
well,
again,
I'll talk to a specialist tax lawyer.
Yeah. So so the specialist tax lawyer will say, why is it fair that the bus driver, the security guard, the trolley person that works at your local supermarket, why is it every dollar of their wage and salary is taxed, but a person that disposes of a capital asset and makes income from it isn't? So if you look at that as an example, it's not fair.
What are you going to do about it?
Well, again, our party is going through that process. We've just been through our regional conferences where Labor Party is a party of people. And so we, through a democratic process through our party, everyone has an opportunity to put forward a remit. We've had our regional conferences where basically from the regional conferences, they get pushed to our annual conference, which is in November this year, and our Policy Council consolidates those remits. So we will debate them and vote on them in November, and then I think New Zealand public who are asking us, and rightfully so, they want to see what's the alternative that Labour will give, and we'll have a better idea post-November.
Sure, and I'm certainly not asking you to put the I's and T's on the policy today. That's a given, right? So we're just trying to get broad directions from you. You've basically said it's not fair that there's not a capital gains tax.
Or an income on capital assets, or capital that's treated as an income, yeah.
There must be, 2 or 3 countries in the whole OECD that don't have one?
One of them, yeah.
One of 3? Mm-hmm. We had on this program the chief executive of the ANZ, the biggest bank in New Zealand, saying it was fair to have a capital gains tax. I mean, you had the mood of the boardroom, 41% saying that they were open to capital gains tax.
Yeah.
How much does Labour need to have the courage to finally say, we're going to do this?
Well, I don't think Labour has ever really lacked courage when it's come to that.
Well, how many times have you campaigned on it? 3 or 4 by my reckoning.
And so that's brave, apparently. Then if you think about,
but never
what you've put to me, yeah. But the question is really to National. Why are they so afraid of it, given the shift in the ground that is currently happening? When the ANZC was on your show and talked about that, their first point of attack was to attack her for potentially her political future that she wants to do. It's like, no, we need to have this conversation. We need our senior business leaders to basically help New Zealand as a public be informed about what a capital gains tax or what this whole discussion around structural reform looks like. To shut it down, though, I think that's irresponsible of both the government and of political parties, because it comes down to informing people of what the different options are.
Sure, but given most of us don't have investment properties, and look, I don't know how you'll configure the policy in the end, but the main focus here is on investment properties, isn't it? On second properties other than the family home. That's the traditional focus. So given most of us don't have those investment properties, and the majority it wouldn't be affected and impacted by that, why is it so difficult to campaign on?
And I'd say this because it's only my second term as a politician, and both in 2020 and obviously 2023 we didn't have a capital gains tax. And I can only really go off what I observed, both as a person working in Parliament at the time that Labour was going through that tax working group policy process, and then observing Labour from afar. I think it was 2014 when they last took capital gains tax. I think there is a fear-mongering that does happen outside in the general public, which is basically Labour is tax and spend are going to take going to tax you for your first home, and it's so complicated, it's difficult. And yet the evidence shows from across the world, again, the IMF, the OECD, and again, as you're saying, the ground shifting, as we've seen through the mood of the boardroom, it comes down to being able to inform people what that looks like, because tax is technical. And so, the example that you used to me about the investment properties, that's not a comprehensive capital gains tax. And then what do you do around Māori held land? What do you do around farmers who hold land? And then also, if you think about a comprehensive capital gains tax, as the tax working group looked at, should personal assets be set aside from comprehensive capital gains? So personal assets such as jewellery and art. What about business, intangibles? So there are so many different ways that you can cut a capital gains tax or a comprehensive capital gains tax. It just requires clear communication and information setting, which we as a Labour Party want to be able to have people outside of politics being able to help with that discussion.
What about a wealth tax? What is your thinking on that?
And again, it's clearly one that's in the mix for Labour. It was one, obviously, that Grant Robertson and David Parker tried to push ahead last year, but then obviously Chippy made the call and Cabinet supported it for it there not to be a wealth tax.
Again, where does that sit in your priorities, though?
It's definitely in the mix because it's a priority for our party to consider it as a potential way for a new revenue measure. But there are obviously, the same way with capital gains tax, the pros and cons. The cons with the wealth tax is around capital flight. People say that those, depending on where you put the threshold for where the wealth tax should start to apply, they believe that, wealthy people will take their wealth offshore, which therefore, for me, practically means they'll take jobs offshore or they'll wind up businesses here.
So you're not so keen on a wealth tax?
Well, there's also benefits of it in the sense that the forecasting, I think, that was done for a wealth tax shows that you get a really big spike in revenue. Basically, if you tax that top wealth percentage, you get a big chunk in revenue. So again, I go back to the structural challenge. What do we want our children to retire with in 2060, given healthcare costs, super, and then working backwards from that?
Would Labor do both, or is it one or the other?
Don't know where we're going to land, and I can't rule it out and I can't rule it in either. It'd be really difficult. I'm being really frank here. It'd be so difficult to be able to do both of them.
Which is the top priority? Surely a capital gains tax is a higher priority for you, is it?
I think the general public have a bit more awareness of it. Obviously, we have senior business leaders talking about it. And again, I'm that team player. I'm going to have this discussion within our own party and see where we land. And it'll be my responsibility, ultimately, to be able to communicate it and work through it to make it workable.
Before we leave tax, would this, in your mind, be revenue neutral? In other words, if you did do a capital gains tax, for example, would that mean a reduction in income taxes elsewhere, so to make it revenue neutral? Or do we need this revenue to fund the kinds of things that you've been talking about?
And that's a really good question, because I have been thinking a lot about that, which is it's easier to make it politically more palatable if you do a tax switch with it, so obviously a bit like the GST change that was last done, in legislation, GST went up, personal income tax rates came down. It's the same thing, right? So you do capital gains tax and you bring down personal income tax levels, or as I'm hearing from the business sector, bring down the corporate tax rate. Again, with those challenges coming ahead though, we need to have a really strong discussion and work through the different options as to whether that's actually possible. So yes, it's definitely more palatable, but whether we will land on that, again, we haven't actually decided as a party. We'll know more after November. One
of the big challenges, and I think you've raised it already, is the cost of superannuation. I think it's set to increase 50% by 2060 in terms of the share of GDP. Are you open to moving the age of entitlement for superannuation?
And again, that's not our policy at the moment. I can put my hand on heart and say that Labor's policy at the moment is to keep it at 65.
So are you open to moving that?
Again, have to have those policy discussions. What for me is to really, what weighs me against having to raise that is that a lot of people who work in manual labour jobs, they're retiring earlier because the jobs are more difficult.
Sure, but is it sustainable? I quote Cameron Bagri recently, any politician saying the status quo is sustainable or affordable needs a refresher in maths. Now, I don't think you need that, but do you think that this is sustainable or affordable at the current settings?
Well, it comes down to choices. And those are the choices that Labor will have to make as part of our policy process as to where we go. So I'm not ruling it out, but the thing is, our position today is that super is to stay at 65. Our party is very strong on that.
Yeah, but you're not ruling out change.
For that reason of equity. Again, we need to look at the structural reform that needs to be done in order to afford super in the future.
But you're not ruling out a change in the entitlement age?
I can rule it out today because Labor's position is it's 65.
This economy has been in recession really for 2 years. How would you be working to bring us out of recession and into growth again?
Yeah, and again, I thank you for asking that question, because a lot of people ask me about tax, again, because of my tax part, but this is a real big part of the question to help with that structural reform. So the biggest thing that I'm doing at the moment is I'm talking to a number of our business leaders and asking them, okay, when you started this business at year 3, because most businesses fall within the first 2 years, at year 3, you're kind of in that mindset of growth, stabilisation, or potentially folding up, because you're like, actually, it's too hard. That's if you haven't failed your business anyway in the first 2 years. What are the things that helped you in that year 3 to grow? I'm also asking more established business leaders who have done this for a number of years, what would help you to grow even further? Some of them have said the R&D tax credit has helped. talking to the village goldsmith just a couple of days ago who are in Wellington. They've got this amazing new technology that they've formed around their jewellery, which they're going to international markets and will be launching next year. It's the R&D tax credit that helped them, and then further on back in the day, it was part of the Callaghan grants.
So you're in that listening phase
Absolutely.
with those business leaders.
And it's quite fun, if I'm really frank. Like, it's really nice to have ideas and new ideas, because I don't have all the answers.
All right. Just a couple of minutes to go. I just want to kind of finish where we started in some respects. I mean, if you were in a leadership position in a future Labour government, what could you offer your 5-year-old self in that moment of deep challenge for you?
Oh, yeah, that 5-year-old self that just lost her mum. Sorry, this is having a water. I think that everything's going to be okay. And, you know, I think about, again, those structural challenges. I want everything to be okay for my kids. And the reason why I got into politics was there's a lot of kids that don't have opportunities like my kids. So it makes me a bit emotional. But that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much for coming in. I really appreciate your time.
Sorry about the tears.
That's all right. Thanks for the tax advice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara Edmonds. That was 30 minutes with Barbara Edmonds. This is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We'll catch you next time. Ka kite.